Good morning, colleagues and friends. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this session. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. Please make sure that you are on mute. Please also note that the session will be recorded. Our keynote speaker will speak for 40 minutes, and when she's finished, I will open it up for discussion. The chat function can be used to post questions and comments during the presentation. During the discussion period, questions and comments can also be made using the chat. So without further ado, I would like to give the virtual floor to our postgraduate student, Douglas Zinyemba, who is going to formally introduce our keynote speaker, Ms. Judith February. Douglas.
Thank you for the opportunity. It is my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Ms. Judith February. A bit about Judith February. She is a lawyer, governance specialist, and columnist for publications such as The Daily Maverick and her own Between the Line, which appeared fortnightly in Cape Town newspapers until 2014. Ms. February is a visiting fellow at Rhodes University School of Governance. Prior to this, she was executive director of the Human Sciences Research Council's Democracy and Governance Unit. She was also head of IDASA's South African Governance Program for 9 years. Ms. February is an author of the book titled Turning and Turning, Exploring the Complexities of South African Democracy. She studied at the University of Cape Town, where she got her Bachelor of Arts degree, majoring in law and Latin, a LIB degree, and a LIM degrees, respectively. She has worked as an attorney from 1996 up until 2000. Ms. February has also worked extensively on issues of good governance, transparency, and accountability within the South African context, and her focus is primarily on corruption and its impact on governance. She's also a regular commentator in the media on the politics within South Africa. Ms. February has also taught courses on contemporary South African politics at the University of Cape Town. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Ms. Judith February.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Douglas, for that welcome. It really is an honor for me to deliver this address this morning, and I hope that I can stick to time. I must say, I feel a little bit like an imposter. In fact, I am an imposter. I'm a lawyer by training and not a political scientist. And I'm not sure what it says about me or about political science, but I fled politics one, vowing never to return to the subject again. But thank you, Sally, nevertheless, Sally Matthews for the invite and Douglas Zinyemba for their impeccable organizing. We've been talking for over a year as COVID-19 threw all kinds of spanners in the works, but here we are finally and virtually. As has been said before, we come together around the theme, rethinking politics in a time of crisis. We speak about South Africa in this context, and we speak today amidst increased turmoil in our own country and around the world. The past week, we've seen the fall of Kabul and truly painful images on our screens running on a loop. Could Annie Proulx's acceptance speech at the National Book Foundation's award in 2017 have been any more on point when she said, and I quote, "We don't live in the best of all possible worlds. This is a Kafkaesque time. The television sparkles with images of despicable political louts, sexual harassment reports. We cannot look away from the pictures of furious elements, hurricanes and fires, from the repetitive crowd murders by gunmen burning with rage. We are made more anxious by flickering threats of nuclear war. We observe social media's manipulation of a credulous population, a population dividing into bitter tribal cultures. We're living through a massive shift from representative democracy to something called viral direct democracy, now cascading over us in a garbage-laden tsunami of raw data. Everything is situational, seesawing between gut response likes or vicious confrontations. For some, this is a heady time of brilliant technological innovation that is bringing us into an exciting new world. For others, it is the opening of a savagely difficult book without a happy ending, close quote. Here at home, we're also living through the aftermath of the violence in July, carried in real time on our television screens. We've just marked the second anniversary of the brutal murder of Uyinene Mqwetiana. The Chief Director of Financial Accounting in the Gauteng Department of Health, Babita Deokaran, was killed on Monday in what investigators believe was a targeted hit. Deokaran was one of the witnesses in the fraudulent COVID-19 PPE contracts investigation. At Parliament, we've seen someone compromised and herself the subject of a corruption investigation become the Speaker of our Parliament. And to add to this week, we've seen Stats SA release our unemployment statistics. South Africa's unemployment rate has risen to a new record of 34.4% in the second quarter of this year, from 32.6% in the first quarter, according to Stats SA. That translates to 7.8 million jobless people, 584,000 more than in the first 3 months of this year. By the expanded definition of unemployment, that is including those individuals who've given up looking for work, that percentage now stands at 44.4%, or 12 million people. South Africa is therefore in a perfect storm. We are experiencing a social, political, and an economic crisis, coupled with institutional fragility. Our constitutional order hangs by a thread, and ever-deepening levels of inequality. And added to that, we are dealing with a global pandemic. What we saw since March last year in our hard lockdown was that COVID-19 has possibly predictably laid bare all our society's weaknesses, the fragility of human life, of economies, and the systems that underpin it. It's also laid bare the prejudices within our society and placed unbearable strain on every sinew of our democracy. The latest NIDS crime survey tells us that the number of children between 7 and 17 dropping out of school tripled from pre-pandemic levels to more than 750,000 in May 2021. Among primary-aged children, researchers have said that between March 2020 and June this year, most lost between 70% to a full year of learning. The crisis that indicates we will bear the consequences of in the future. Youth unemployment stands at 63%. Achille Mbembe has called this a negative moment in our history. But in a sense, the negative moment is a culmination of sorts, a culmination of the Zuma years, of 10 years of state capture that were marked by a lack of openness and transparency and by an increased securitization of the state. Added to that, of course, the inequality, rising economic paralysis, and also intolerance and an abuse of democratic institutions. But Rhodes University academic Anthea Garman has also written that South Africa is going through a moment of quite powerful rupture. The rupture is not so much with the apartheid of colonial past, as much as with the immediate democratic past, which has failed to deliver on its promises of equality for all, and which has its own lack of credible rupture with the apartheid past. We're used to seeing in South Africa the violence of poverty and the violence of the state. Particularly during the COVID-19 lockdown, we have seen a careless disregard of rights, people's civil and political rights, with no accountability for breaches. Collins Corsa died in his own backyard. We see the palpable violence of poverty and exclusion by the most vulnerable of citizens every day. Two instances stand out. The 2014 death of 5-year-old Michael Kamapi, who fell into a pit latrine at school and drowned, and the Life Esidimeni tragedy, which saw over 100 people die after the Gauteng Health Department moved them from existing care facilities run by NGOs. They stand out as the most brutal examples of the neglect of the state, alongside the Marikana massacre of mine workers by police in 2012. As Michael Kamapi's father, James, said in his testimony to the Limpopo High Court in the civil matter, they, the state, should have helped. My son was going to school. I did not send him to die. We ask ourselves then, where was the political leadership? Where was the politicians' shame at what had happened? And where was their desire to make amends? Instead, the state fought back against the most vulnerable of families and doubled their pain by continuing to defend itself in this protracted litigation. Similarly, the Life Esidimeni tragedy was another shocking manifestation of our callous state. The facts are well known to us, the stories heart-wrenching. But this lack of care manifests itself across our country daily into almost any government building for an interaction with the state, and we confront snaking queues of people standing for hours. Mostly the service is inefficient. It is a state that has become so arrogant, so unmoored from its principles, that it is prepared to deny the most vulnerable in our society their basic rights. This form of violence, and there's no other word for it, creates greater marginalization for the poor and mostly for Black South Africans. But in the past couple of years, we've seen a process of trying to rebuild this country of ours, which is so broken. We've had to, however, come to terms with what we saw in July and the violence of July, and what I term the enemy within. And there's a really good quote which can be attributed to Cicero, although I'm told that it's attributed to him, but it can't be proven that it was said by him. But it's worth quoting anyway. It says, "A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and carries his banner openly. But the traitor moves among those within the gate freely, his sly whispers rustling through all the alleys, heard in the very halls of government itself. For the traitor appears not a traitor. He speaks in accents familiar to his victims, and he wears their face in their arguments. He appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation. He works secretly and unknown in the night to undermine the pillars of the city. He infects the body politic so that it can no longer resist." We have come to terms with that in July, and the ANC, many within the ANC who were complicit in the violence and chaos of July. What we witnessed then was a fire sparked by former President Jacob Zuma's arrest and his shameful coterie of the corrupt. They're a motley and dangerous crew posing a clear and present danger to our democracy. We now know that they would indeed raise this country to the ground to escape accountability. We've seen the alternative that they offer, a state unbound by rules. They are within the state, within Zuma's own family, and within the ANC itself. It's a spine-chilling prospect that there are those within the police and who were in President Ramaphosa's cabinet who would simply stand back and let it all burn. That there needs to be an urgent revamp of the intelligence agencies is obvious. However, there is more work to be done if we are to rebuild our democracy. And so in this context, of course, which is a context of crisis, we are called upon to rethink our democracy, to rethink the way in which we engage with politics. Because what we saw in July was a mixture of things, and we're still in the process of making sense of it all. The president, in his address, called it an insurrection, and he told us, we know who they are. Despite this, only 2 people have been arrested, and they appear to have tenuous links to the violence that we witnessed in July. What we know is that the awful events live streamed was a mixture of organized violence, a veritable carnival of violence and destruction, an attack on the state and infrastructure, wanton criminality, and then finally the desperation by those on the fringes of society. So how in this context do we try to preserve the configurations of our democracy? How do we preserve our constitution? How do we protect and defend it? In these times of crisis, I believe that we must keep on making the argument for greater political accountability and greater transparency, for better leadership and active citizenship. A framework is always helpful when thinking about South Africa and the kind of democracy that we want to live in, and how we balance citizen voice and participatory democracy, which is so fundamental to our constitution, and the accountability on the part of those who exercise public power. When I was at IDASA, our understanding of democracy helped us understand balance between citizens and those in power, in my view, in a more structured way. We've always asked ourselves then the following questions, and they remain instructive. To what extent does the political system in a particular country enable its citizens to build popular, accountable, and sustainable self-government? To what extent can citizens influence and control those who make decisions about public affairs, including elected representatives and government appointees at all levels? And to what extent do citizens enjoy equality with each other in these governance processes? We have several challenges as we seek to entrench rights and indeed the supremacy of what is increasingly becoming a contested terrain, the Constitution itself. Part of that is about political opportunism, but part of it is also our collective failure to ensure that there is proper constitutional education and that the language of rights becomes more popularized, but also that the Constitution works for those at the margins of our society. Recently, it has become fashionable to question the 1994 constitutional negotiated settlement and its outcome. And at this distinct moment of schism, it's always helpful to take a step back. But I want to segue into a reference to the Levitsky and Ziblatt work on how democracies die. They identify certain characteristics of a dying democracy. It happens, they posit, not in one fell swoop. It happens often, democracies die slowly, insidiously. And modern democracies, their prophet, die slowly and from the inside, even at the hands of their main representatives. Sounds quite familiar to the enemy within. We've seen across the world authoritarianism tendencies, whether it's Orban in Hungary, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Donald Trump. And the erosion of the democracy often takes place in a piecemeal fashion by baby steps. Each individual step sometimes seems minor. None appears to truly threaten democracy. And indeed, governments often move to subvert democracy and they under the veneer of legality. They proffer 4 signs of a dying democracy. First, rejecting the rules of democracy. Secondly, discrediting one's political opponent. Third, tolerating or encouraging violence. And finally, those in power seek to reduce our civil rights. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to connect some of these dots that we're seeing in our body politic today. And the key, of course, is how to constrain those in power or keep those authoritarians out of power. Levitsky and Ziblatt proffer the political party as the key vehicle to stopping this sort of death of democracy. In the South African case, I would argue that that might be rather difficult, and perhaps even in the case of the United States and around the world, where the political party is in fact the vehicle for much of this erosion of democracy. They then talk about institutional design, and even when institutions are perfectly designed, they're worthless if they're not accompanied by democratic behavior that sustains and gives sense to these norms. And I believe in South Africa, we are at that moment where our institutions are hollowed out and have been hollowed out by the 9 wasted years, almost a decade of state capture. And the institutional fragility that we're seeing all around us is simply proof of that. But despite the fragility that we're in, I'd like to make the case today for a renewed commitment to constitutionalism. The Constitution represents the framework around which everything else pivots. It has been much maligned, even by the very ANC that fought for its adoption. We have a former president who has sought to undermine the Constitution at every turn. But for me, it remains the lodestar, the aspirational document our founding fathers and mothers intended. It may have its faults, but in essence, it is transformational and provides a broad framework for bringing about socioeconomic equality. But any constitution can only be as effective as the men and women who are charged with implementing the country's rules, as well as creating a culture of accountability, which we as citizens need to demand. Our constitution is clear about the kind of state we're seeking to build: a multi-party system of democratic government to ensure accountability, responsiveness, and openness. My own understanding of democracy is infused with this understanding of the Constitution and its central place in our society. That we've strayed so far from this ideal, and that inequality has risen and corruption have risen so dramatically, is not the fault of the Constitution. Accountability means that government is responsive to the interests of the whole of society, what Aristotle called the common good, rather than to its own narrow self-interest. Accountability must be more than procedural accountability, but it has to be substantive. So in other words, the Constitution has to be seen to work for those at the fringes of our society. The argument against the Constitution has been made repeatedly with passion and fervor. Somehow it's been scapegoated in the process, when in fact what we ought to be doing is joining the dots between the corruption we're seeing on a daily basis, mismanagement, poor governance, and state capture, and therefore the failure of the state to deliver basic services. It was the ANC that, under the astute and principled leadership of O.R. Tambo, supported the concept of a Bill of Rights when the moment arose. Tambo was set upon constitutionalizing aspects of the struggle, and in the words of Albie Sachs, learning from every source and widening the embrace of the ANC as a movement and in its thinking. He was keen to strategically position the Bill of Rights so that it would exist to protect everyone, as Tambo said, black and white, rich and poor, and essentially that protection was against arbitrariness by all leaders, and indeed, as Tambo said, to be used against ourselves. And how times have changed. Key to our Constitution, of course, is the notion of voice, the notion of participation. However, in South Africa, what we have seen, despite the strong thread that runs through the Constitution, is that a lot of this of the participatory nature of the Constitution has been reduced to citizens voting every 5 years. But the notion of active citizenship has really been, only arises when people feel the need to protest, and often those protests are violent. And protest, of course, is a form of voice. What many in small towns across the country and in much research have said is they feel as if they're watching a passing show. They voice frustration at those who are in power only coming out when we protest, when we burn things. I think this week, some of you might have seen the Afrobarometer research that has come out. And it's got some very worrying trends with regard particularly to trust in democratic institutions, particularly trust in parliament, trust in premiers, trust in the ruling party. These are at an all-time low, trust in the president. And importantly, that a large number of people are very willing to forego a non-elected government or leader if we could get to a point where there was law and order and where people would have socioeconomic delivery, so houses and jobs and so on. These are worrying examples in a time of crisis and uncertainty, because all around us, as I've said, we've seen a move to authoritarianism and away from democracy. And so we would do well to be vigilant in our society today. So, but what all of this shows us, and what the violence of July has shown, is that we are the ones we've been waiting for. It is up to us to remake, reclaim, and renew this democracy. We know that the ANC cannot fix it. And if the ANC cannot fix it, divided as we are at a moment of crisis now where we need a collective effort from business, civil society, communities, individual citizens to speak out against the inaction fueled by those who would consign our country to a dustbin of corrupt politicians, or where whistleblowers are murdered in front of their homes. I would argue that it is not too late to do so. But before I talk about a way forward, there are two lessons I think that perhaps we need to think more carefully about. And the first one is the lessons of our early years, the lessons of our transition, which I believe we have not internalized enough, which would have been that to try to fix the economy in some way and to create sufficient trust between the economic players, based on an understanding that a fair wage, creating a proper skills-based entrepreneurship, artisanship, education should be supported. And importantly, too, that some form of shared sacrifice would be necessary to deal with the ravages of the past. Some are now suggesting an economic codessa to deal with the triple ills of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. And then lesson 2 might be that our trust deficit was papered over by the Rainbow Nation discourse, and our TRC never fully allowed us to deal with the past. The past lies between us in every debate about race and class, in every disagreement about structural inequality and an economy built on cheap labor. Too many victims' questions remain unanswered while the perpetrators walk amongst us. The current lack of accountability then by those in power now seems built on the lack of accountability with regard to the past. And as Antjie Krog says so eloquently in her extraordinary poem, Country of Grief and Grace, but if the old is not guilty, does not confess, then of course the new can also not be guilty, not be held accountable. If it repeats the old, things may then continue as before, but in a different shade. So finally, what should our focus be in building this democracy? There are 6 areas that I've identified. The first is it has to be education, education, education. Clearly, our post-apartheid South Africa's greatest failure has been education, despite the fact that we've spent more on education as a percentage of GDP than any other area. We have been hampered by weak administration and our ability to educate the next generation for a different kind of economic reality. Too many children simply drop out of school. And as I've said before and quoted the NIDS-CRAM statistics of those who have dropped out of school during this pandemic, too many children, too much reliance is placed on matric results and the annual puff that surrounds that, where a small percentage of those young adults are able to go to university. But we've also had a post-1994 culture and country, which is based on a flawed notion of empowerment. Education has often taken a back seat in the national discourse that prizes crass wealth accumulation above the emancipatory power of a decent education. This will continue to cost us dearly, and there are no quick fixes. We will need further investment and a serious commitment to proper intellectual pursuit in our country. This is work that is so important, and the work of universities. For too long, we've prized the material above the ability to think critically. This is the cornerstone of any society if we're trying to build a culture of democracy. But instead, we've been littered with politicians driving German SUVs in a form of empowerment that has preferred political proximity. But a subset of that is constitutional education. What is the Constitution and what is its purpose? How does it provide the checks and balances and give rise to a culture of accountability? How did we get here? And whose rights are protected in Chapter 2 of our Constitution? What does it mean to say that socioeconomic rights are justiciable? And what were the cases that were brought before the court which protected the rights of the most vulnerable? This is particularly important at a moment where we're experiencing institutional and constitutional fragility, when the former president cocks a snoop at the Constitutional Court. Who will protect and defend our Constitution? Who will march in its defense? We need to, again, recommit ourselves to a culture of accountability. The culture of accountability is about consequences for those who are elected. Deference should not be part of that culture. Respect, yes. Deference, no. But what we need is active citizens who, in fact, demand accountability for what has gone wrong. The Constitution demands of us that an accountability which is more complex and which is also about listening to each other's stories, about listening to what has happened before, but about holding those in power to account. We need to also be more astute about connecting the dots between the information we receive via one of our democracy's most crucial elements, a free and independent media. How does corruption affect people's lives? How does a tender awarded to a politician, his or her family, mean that the poor don't receive the services they need? This information needs to be popularized and disseminated widely if it's to have maximum impact. The right to information, as Dale McKinley has argued elsewhere, has been viewed as a secondary human right, and so transparency and accountability have not been prioritized. But we need further to, if we're going to mobilize this right to information, we need further to focus on citizen activism. And here I draw on the work of American activist and academic Harry Boyt. He's worked extensively on reimagining the civic space and understanding how societies can move towards a more citizen-centered politics. He starts from the premise of respectful conversations that shift the center away from politics and from politicians, because what we understand now from the violence of July is that we need to be looking elsewhere for the solutions which lie within our communities. His work was mostly in 1960s America and during the civil rights movement, where civic spaces were reimagined in venues ranging from churches to beauty parlors to community youth groups and so on. He champions the notion of broad-based community organizing in colleges and other spaces where citizens can see themselves as co-creators with the state and not simply voting fodder. So the question then is, are South Africans mature enough to do what Boyt suggests and to work across their differences to solve common problems and advance justice, create community wealth in schools, public spaces, libraries, businesses, in relation to art, music, healthy lifestyles? In the examples he cites in educational spaces, teams of young people work on real-world issues, campaigns against bullying, sexual harassment, racism, teen pregnancy, gang violence, and making curriculum changes. In South Africa, Equal Education, for instance, has done similar work with learners, governing bodies, school management, and parents. It's aimed at creating safer school environments, ensuring the state develops norms and standards around educational infrastructure, and demanding transport to and from school for children living far away. These localized initiatives have been possible because of the mobilization of students and parents. And I believe it's a model worth extending to other areas of socioeconomic development where the state has abdicated its responsibilities. In the South African context, we can see where such creative citizenship, a co-creation with the state, could take us. It would go beyond passive citizenship and the mere demanding of rights and the technocracy which the state visits upon us, towards a more meaningful interaction between citizens and their public representatives. Is there any wonder then that citizens who experience a lack of voice, that in our society burning has become commonplace? In the Fees Must Fall movement, there were nascent signs of our ability to build the kinds of circles of learning and meaning within universities that are needed for us to talk about decolonization in other areas. But those circles need to become more inclusive, I believe, to reap real benefits. The Right to Know campaign has pursued successful campaigns over several years with regard to the cost of mobile phone data. The hashtag Data Must Fall has mobilized communities where mobile phones have become a crucial way of communication. However, more needs to be done in terms of moving towards a broader, more liberating notion of citizenship as work and as co-creating with the state. And for this to happen, we do need education regarding rights and responsibilities in the Constitution within schools and other places of learning. But this also requires all sectors of society to work together to be part of reimagining civic life, including business. As the World Economic Forum has argued, companies need to see the benefits of defending civic space, which includes the freedom of citizens to organize, speak up, protest, and protest against the failings of corruption. In a 2017 WEF report, it said the fraying rule of law and declining civic freedoms have become a major global risk for companies. Close quote. In South Africa, this will mean that business too will have to recreate its role as citizen to operate ethically with regard to workers' rights, occupational safety, and transparent tender processes. The penultimate point I want to make is that we're looking to a society which is more sustainable. And part of what this will mean is regulating private power, regulating corporations more astutely. What we've seen is that our weak state has also been complicit in paving the way for rogue corporations and private interests to undermine democracy and development. We've seen this in two ways: the state capture project, which has created a crisis for our democracy, and in many ways has led to the violence of July. It is an unhealthy congealing of the private and the public, and it has undermined South Africa's administrative capacity, but also hollowed out many institutions and eroded rights. In the past week, we've seen how this collusion of the public and the private sector of spheres have brought about, in many cases, the degradation of the environment, and why sustainability should be top of our priority list. This past week, we saw in the United Phosphorus Limited case in KZN, in the wake of the violence, a warehouse next to a supermarket across the road from a school is filled with hazardous waste. Only when the violence erupts, the warehouse is on fire, firefighters walk in, they realize that there is hazardous waste. The only way we know what hazardous chemicals are inside this warehouse is because of investigative journalism. The firefighters, there was secrecy around the contents. So the question is, how was this allowed to happen? What kind of collusion was happening between the state and the private sector to allow this to happen? Where was the environmental impact assessment? Where were the environmental and regulatory controls? This hazardous waste is now finding its way into communities, into rivers, and so on, into wetlands, onto beaches. And investigations need to happen, but we need to hold corporate South Africa to account as well. And it reminded me of the story in 2013 of the collapse of the Tongaat Mall, when 2 workers died. Jay Singh, the owner, simply sold it afterwards. There was an inquiry. The NPA has the file. Workers have said, we have lost faith in the system after failing us. Too many promises were made. Some of us who were not here lost limbs and suffered excruciating pain. And so this, if we want a society which is livable, one which is sustainable, that nexus, the private and the public, needs to be better managed. The final point is a point about leadership, and it's often unfashionable to call for leadership because it's seen as citizens abdicating their responsibilities to men and women who know better. But what our current government has shown is that where there's a lack of leadership, it has deep consequences for the future. Into a vacuum of leadership, everything falls. And the examples of Nelson Mandela as president intervening at a moment of deep crisis in South Africa, Chris Hani's death, but also a president who showed himself to be subordinate to the Constitution by taking the stand himself in the SAAPS case. That is the kind of leadership that South Africa needs, that we should be asking of those in power. Our country sorely needs that, but we also need the citizens who do the work of democracy. My former boss always used to say that the quiet work of democracy goes on in our country every day, despite the excesses of our government. It requires thoughtfulness on each of our parts as to how we respond and when we do to what we see around us. The Constitution has provided us with a broad architecture, but it requires us to give flesh to the bones. And I believe that what Boyt and others are arguing for, and in equal education and other social movements, what they're arguing for is rebuilding democracy from below. And I think this builds very well on the work that Vern Harris and others are doing at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And they're using the arguments that Judith Butler has used for building bonds of interdependency and a new social imaginary. Butler argues that we need to move away from the rampant individualism, which has caused lives and livelihoods to be lost, swathes of humanity to be discarded, and has caused environmental degradation. And we need to move towards the philosophy of living, of more sustainable bonds, greater forms of interdependency remade by people. She asks, and I quote, that we talk about care before competition, provisioning before growth, sharing before accumulation, livability before existence, and sustaining before extracting and discarding. How do we then reconsider these social bonds? The only way is to rebuild our democracy from below. As Butler argues, it's not just other human lives, but other sensate creatures, environments, and infrastructures. We depend on them and they depend on us in turn to sustain a livable world. And so we must make no mistake that the rebuilding of our democracy, particularly after the ashes of July, will be for the long haul. And so the question I think we have to ask ourselves in this time of crisis, and I'm quite sure that this conference will address, is what is the work for us to do? It's an individual question, but it's also a collective question for each of us as we try to create a world which is more equal, more sustainable, and more livable. Thank you.
Thank you for that splendid presentation, Judith. So now I'll open the floor for questions. I've got a few questions here from the audience. So how do you prefer to do this? Do you want to take one or two questions at one time, or how do you want to do it?
It's fine, Mandisi, I'm in your hands.
Okay. I'll give you two at one point, and then we can take it from there. So the first question is, preserving, assuming the questioner is referring to your argument that we need to protect our democracy. So the question is, preserving and protecting our democracy against whom? That's the first question. And the second question is, to what extent is the weakening of the political opposition enabled the growth of autocratic tendencies amidst COVID-19? So I'll give you a chance to, react to those two questions.
Thanks. So the first question is protecting and defending our democracy against whom? Well, against those who would come against those forces within our society, primarily those who are in power, elected representatives, who are trying to undermine our rights. And that happens in a variety of ways. So whether it is with regard to whether it is a free and independent media, giving and investigative journalists holding government to account by putting information out there about egregious breaches of rights. Most of the things that we know about, for example, the information with regard to state capture, for instance, most of that is because of investigative journalism. And now we have the Zondo Commission, but that is also streamed live on our television screens. And I don't think we should underestimate that. So it's protecting and defending our democracy against any the enemy within and the enemy outside who would undermine our freedoms, our civil and political rights, but also a state. For example, in the Life Essie Domeni and Michael Kamapi matter, who is comfortable with children drowning in their feces, a state which is comfortable, where the Minister of Social Development is comfortable having elderly people sprayed with water while they're waiting in a queue for their grants. So it's against all egregious breaches of rights and the excess of power. That is what the Constitution is, a bulwark against the exercise of power in a way which undermines all of our rights and our civil and political rights. So the question about opposition politics, yes, I mean, of course, the problem that we have in South Africa is multifold. So so on the one hand, you have a governing party which is in the majority with waning support, and I'm quite sure that Colette Herzenberg and others will be talking about that over at your conference. But so you have a political party, the ANC, so waning support, but also it is essentially unfit for purpose. You have a party which is so divided, and really in an ideal world, you cannot have these different factions operating because one undermines the other. And so, but at the same time, you have a weak opposition politics. And so weak opposition, which means that the ANC is never truly held to account. And so that's got to then come from citizens in other ways. And I mean, one can go into whether the way in which people indicate opposition to political parties in our local government elections, which may or may not happen in October. Will people simply stay away, or will they vote for the opposition? I mean, what we've seen is the trend is that there's high voter apathy, particularly amongst young people. So it is a weakness and a failure of the opposition to mobilize and to take advantage of the ANC's weaknesses, and also to organize itself in a way which is not the EFF, which is sort of more extreme in a way, and then the DA, which has its own internal problems. So definitely a failure of political imagination to grasp the nettle and to provide some sort of opposition to the ANC. But the opposition comes in different ways, though. So it comes in formal party politics. And I was doing a book launch on the weekend with a book, the Democratic Marxism series, which was edited by Michelle Williams and Vish Satgar. And I mean, they argue for solutions outside of the political party. I mean, my view is that is representative democracy. It's necessary, but not sufficient. So we need to have other bulwarks within our society, which I tried to talk about in my talk. Thanks.
Great, thank you for that. So as a follow-up to your latter response, the question again from the audience reads, what does that all mean about building a more resilient democracy post-COVID? And then the second question is, what is democracy without popular power?
Well, so firstly, I think with regard to COVID-19, so what you, as I was trying to indicate, is what you've seen every element of our society, all of the strain on the society laid bare. So institutional fragility, this social crisis, an economic crisis, a political crisis, all happening at once, and a health crisis. And that has laid bare who we are. And who we are shows that the kitty is bare, our institutions are hollowed out, and the process of rebuilding is going to be a very slow one. Allow me to, because I'm looking at Kabela Matlosa's question on how democracies die. And the point about deepening social inequality and deepening poverty and unemployment, Kabela, that completely. I mean, part of what I was saying is that if we look at the backdrop to where we are, it's a combination of all of these factors which undermine institutions and which cause them not to work. But also, and I'm again responding to the question in the chat about constitutions. And so my point about constitutional education is there needs to be a push for that, because to understand that the Constitution provides the framework in which citizen rights can be realized, in which we get to a more just society. And so this idea that we blame the framework for what government has done wrong, that's a poor argument in my view. And so we protect the Constitution because the alternative is what we saw in July, a state unbound by rules, and individuals who are simply above the law. And so we are fighting our way back, scraping our way back. And I think the Constitutional Court judgment on this rescission application for President Zuma is going to be crucial, in defining the parameters of the Constitution, who it applies to, and our court. So, of course, everything, in South Africa, every analysis has to be colored by our levels of unemployment, inequality, poverty, and also by race and class. We can't get away from that. You're more likely to be Black and poor in South Africa than white and poor. And so, but the question about popular power, well, it's up to us. So if we argue for mass movements, we argue for, I have democracy from below. it's up to us then to mobilize ourselves and to have our voices heard within communities. And I think what the Boyt argument and what we see in South Africa already, there are plenty of examples of organizations building democracy from below and demanding accountability. We are out of the phase in a sense. I mean, there are two phases here. So the one is the big stuff, because we have to worry about the framework. We have to worry about the Constitution being completely undermined. We have to worry about all those things and protect and defend in different ways. But then we have to use our rights. Rights are only won through struggle. So that popular power comes from below. And South Africans have a history of that. And we need to find our voices. Post-94, what has happened is we have been passive recipients, in a sense, of rights, too much technocracy, too little voice, too little participation.
Thanks, Judith. So I've got a comment here from a member of the audience. So the comments reads, clearly, the people in South Africa are without power and are not free, even though the country attained freedom in 1994. So could you please react to that? And then there's a question. What about the swing to the right wing of politics and rise of ultra-nationalism across the world? That is, racism, xenophobia, and homophobia. So you want to tackle those?
Yeah, so on we are not free. Well, so there is the freedom that we have, which is to vote and so on, and then there's their rights, and then there's the substantive democracy, which is people only feel free in as much as this state delivers to them. I mean, it's very difficult, and we saw this during the COVID-19 lockdown. It's very difficult for people to feel that, you know, during a lockdown, if you're living in a shack, it's very difficult to feel that your rights aren't being protected. And so we are constrained, and this is the point I'm trying to make about giving the Constitution content and meaning. And so the moment you give it content and meaning, and that means that there needs to be economic interventions, there need to be, you know, strengthening of institutions so that these rights have meaning. Because once rights in the Constitution have meaning, people are more likely to protect and defend the Constitution itself. But absent that, you then have people who express skepticism about it, and who would, as the Afrobarometer data has shown us, who would be happy to live in a sort of, authoritarian regime as long as they had a house and food. And so the danger of that thinking, I think, is, you know, we need to continue to try and make sense of that. And so that actually, that's the point I'm making for constitutionalism, but a progressive constitutionalism, a transformative constitutionalism. And that then becomes about transparency. It becomes about accountability. Unfortunately, there are no easy answers to this. About the strain towards authoritarianism around the world, and yes, we have to, in South Africa, the objective conditions are ripe for that sort of, for an authoritarian strain, for strongman leadership, and so on. And so, but it will be up to us whether we accept that or not. It's only going to be through mass movements and through the power of people to accept or not accept certain things. And that power is exercised in different ways. And so, but it would be a mistake for us to think that we are exempt from any of those global trends, that somehow we live here in splendid isolation. You know, when we negotiated our transition to democracy, that was also because of certain geopolitical factors. And the world is in a very precarious position at the moment, as I said at the beginning. And so we need to be vigilant. We need to take guard. So, for example, this, I keep talking about it, but the murder of a woman who is a whistleblower outside her house. I mean, that is should make us all sit up and think, what is this who we are? Is this the kind of gangster state that we live in, where individuals, what will happen next? Investigative journalists are killed, people who write columns, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the sorts of things that, you sit up. So we're not exempt from that. And we've seen low-level killings like that in KZN, in Mpumalanga, Free State, and so on. And what July told us is that we need to be more than vigilant.
Thank you, Judith. So the next question is about the Constitution. The Constitution entrenched dispossession and marginalization of the masses. How does one respect such a Constitution? How does the Constitution protect everyone?
Well, I don't know how, I'm not sure how the Constitution entrenches dispossession and marginalization of the masses. I don't think that the facts bear that comment out. If one looks at the socioeconomic rights, for example, South Africa's constitution is rather progressive. We entrench socioeconomic rights, and that means they're justiciable. And so the Treatment Action Campaign, people can sue for those rights. The question is whether they sue. So people often talk about land in this context and say, well, look at the land issue. Well, if you listen to Dick Moseneki, he'll tell you, I wish somebody had brought a land matter to the court for us to adjudicate, but nobody did. And so I don't know how. There's been very interesting research done by the HSRC and others on the history of the court, the way in which it's interpreted rights, the progressive nature of the court. So I don't think that what has caused a dispossession and marginalization of the majority of South Africans is either poor policy, is corruption, state capture, poor leadership, and a ruling party that has put its own interests above the interests of ordinary citizens. Michael Kamapi's death didn't happen, if we take an example, didn't happen because of the Constitution. It happened because somebody thought, an official thinks it's okay for a 5-year-old child to use a pit latrine toilet and to drown in his feces. And there's no shame about that. And when the courts, when the Kamapi family go to court, our government, our state, opposes the civil litigation. So this is what happens. And in fact, the courts have shown to be, in that case, have shown themselves to be on the side of the vulnerable repeatedly. So I don't think the facts, if you look at the constitutional jurisprudence, I don't think it bears that out. And it says one cannot reduce the Constitution to the Bill of Rights. No, but the Bill of Rights is about socioeconomic rights, and then you have civil and political rights. And so without those freedoms, I think a useful way of thinking about this is if tomorrow we tore up the Constitution, what would life look like? So arbitrary arrest, no access to information, no defending of civil and political rights, possibly no right to vote. That's what it looks like. I think so. It's a broad sketch of the kind of society you want to be.
Thank you, Judith. So you've replied or answered or commented on the comment about how democracies die. So leave that aside because you've tackled that one. So the next question is, I find it interesting that democracy is conceived by you in terms of anonymity. This points to how we are currently working with an outdated concept of what democracy means. So the person here is saying you conceive democracy in terms of enemies and that we have to protect our democracy against these enemies. And so they're saying they find this interesting. So that's the first question. Second question is, can the renewal and reclaiming of our democracy be realized without the ANC? Is the ANC the enemy of democracy? is it desirable to remove the ANC to achieve democracy?
So just the question about enemies. It's not so much, I mean, I think, enemies is a very loaded word. It's any force, any party, any individual those in power who would undermine the Constitution, undermine our rights, who would allow what happened in July to happen. That's not what, that's not what a democracy looks like, where people take to violence. What a democracy looks like is that the former president subjects himself to the rule of law, as Nelson Mandela did when he was called to court. But I don't think it's helpful to look at it in the frame of enemies. I mean, there are all kinds of books, Enemy of the People, etc. The question about the renewal, for me, the question is, can the ANC renew itself? Is it fit for purpose? I mean, I think that in its present form, we have to be honest that it's unfit for purpose, and that the renewal of the ANC and this unity über alles is costing us. And so then the question is, does this party split? And if it splits, what does that look like? I mean, I'm of the view that our future is coalition politics, and that brings with it further elements of instability. Because the ANC is busy cannibalizing itself. And so I'm not sure. The point, though, is that if we live in a democracy, we can vote people out of power. That's our power. And so that, that if people believe that the ANC is not doing its job, there's plenty of evidence in the public domain to suggest that it's not. It's a fact. And so then the question is, what are the choices? And that leads us back to the issue around the point we made earlier about opposition politics. And what is opposition politics? What does it look like? So I think it's more helpful not to talk about it as enemies, but those who would undermine our democracy and those who would undermine our rights and our ability to engage constructively, and those who would loot the state for their own benefit. Yeah.
Thank you, Judith. So the next question is also on the Constitution. Would you agree that the Constitution contains more responsibilities than rights? We often focus on constitutional rights, but do not talk about these in relation to responsibilities. So responsibilities are more implied than rights. If this is the case, is it incumbent on political scientists to make these responsibilities more explicit?
I mean, I think that it is about, the Constitution is about rights. And so we often forget our concomitant responsibilities. And perhaps, but that was the point I was making about constitutional education, is that actually that is where it comes in, that, one is educated to understand that you have a right, but you also have that some rights can be limited. In terms of Section 36, but also that there is a concomitant responsibility on us. And I don't think we've had enough of a conversation about that. And it is not only for political scientists, but for all of us to understand what our responsibilities are. What is citizenship? What does it mean to be an active citizen? What does it mean for me in my street, in my neighborhood? What does that look like? And so yes, I mean, I think we need more constitutional education. We need as much of that as possible, but also a deeper understanding of how rights work, and that rights are also able to be limited. That your right is not you have the right to free speech, but not to hate speech, for example. So rights are also limited in those ways. And sorry, I've seen the comment by Christopher, which says the Constitution doesn't give us rights; it recognizes them. If we don't practice these, the text is not ours. Well, yes, we need to practice them. They're like muscles, I guess.
Right. So the next question is, how do we promote the importance of voting with our university students?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So the question is, how do we promote, the importance and significance of voting, with our university students?
Well, I think it's about using every avenue and every option possible. And so one has to use, it's the same as a campaign. So for example, I find the issues around vaccination, for example, and the campaign the government's launching around that's very interesting, and possibly a way of dealing with that. So it's got to be about mobilizing students, and I think there are plenty of opportunities, and you all would know better than me the opportunities that there are on campuses, student groups, student movements, and to get young people to vote, but also to get young people involved in communities within the university. And that's what I was talking about fees must fall, for example, that where you have a mobilization for good, and we can go on and analyze the fees must fall movement and the mistakes made and so on, but the broad point is that you want that sort of mobilization, because you want agitation, you want a kind of a movement for better. But it also begins with so it's about mobilization, but for me, it also begins with, at university, certainly intellectual input and being taught to critically think, and not just parrot. And that to me is, the central role of the university. And then to be able to have individuals who are able to critically analyze what is happening, to think critically, and therefore to go out and change the world, to be so trite. But mobilizing around voting, there are various avenues in terms of students groups, student movements, and so on. But I think we've got to have a renewed commitment to this constitution, to this democracy. I've talked a lot about the Constitution today, but that's my own, my background. But there's a commitment to the democracy, to what it can give us, to reimagine a different kind of society, and that's the work of every generation. And sometimes, it's one step forward, one step back, but that is important.
Okay, thanks for that. So the next question is, what role do you see for the church in South Africa as it relates to our ethics, morality, and holding politicians accountable?
I think that the church has a role to play as any organization and institution. And certainly we know that before apartheid, the church was instrumental in providing ethical leadership, in providing a space for people to speak out and so on against apartheid. So it's the same role, but like many of these organizations, and we see it in civil society as well, it's about rethinking and reimagining, because what we've seen in the church and in other organized civil society organizations is that there's been a denuding of a lot of those institutions, and they've become so professionalized and so all weakened in a sense, because there was an understanding that democracy had arrived. And so now that democracy has arrived, well, we can all sit back and our work is something different. But the moment calls for us to re-engage and to engage again in the same ways that we engaged before. So the role of the church is like the role of any other organization to play, and whether that is through their different the Council of Churches, or people who talk about the formal elements and the issues within the Constitution, for example, through the Defend Democracy campaign, or if it is around citizen rights and assisting people with realizing that all holding power to account. But we're at a point which is so fragile that we need the leadership, and we need the people within those institutions to be speaking out against the egregious breaches of the Constitution and exercise of power. What we saw in July cannot be normalized. We cannot continue as before. And so it's up to the church, business, everyone, to civil society to be focusing on these issues. And just the question that Kabela, asked about, there was a point about socioeconomic issues and inequality and poverty and so on. And one of the big conversations is around the basic income grant, the universal basic income grant. And there's been some really good research which has been done by civil society organizations on whether we can afford the basic income grant, how you would implement it. So that's also the kind of advocacy and the kind of mobilization that is needed. It's of an intellectual kind, but these things are not mutually exclusive. So there's a panoply of things that one can do. But I think the basic point is that these things are struggle, it's work, and also it is for the long haul. To fix what has been broken is going to take us a very long time in South Africa. So we must be under no illusions, I think, about how hard it's going to be.
Thank you, Judith. So I'm just mindful of the time here. We've got 5 more minutes, so I'll take a few more questions. So the question is, could you give a comparative view on what shows in representative democracies and for democratic education regarding the chaos that unfolded in July in South Africa and at the US Capitol events in January? Did you get that, or you want me to repeat that?
Yeah, no, I could see it. I'm just not sure what exactly you mean on what shows in representative democracies. I'm not sure I understand the question, but if what I thought was interesting was that, what happened in the US in January, what one can draw from that, it's a longer conversation, but that insurrection is interesting from the perspective that democracies are about struggle. And so therefore this idea that you're on a continuum and you're just doing that, even in developed democracies, one cannot take rights for granted, that you might have a Donald Trump who comes along and undermines democracy. And there is an opportunity that there will possibly be an opportunity for him or somebody like him in 4 years' time. And so because that politics, that Trumpism or that politics remains alive. And so so then it's about how do you balance forces, and also how do good people get up to defend what there is. But we say this in the United States context which is deeply polarized, and so it's and also with a very different system to what we have. In South Africa, it's interesting because, the president called this an insurrection. Of course, the Minister of Defense said it wasn't one, and then she said that it was. So I think we're not yet at a point where we can completely make sense of what happened in July. What we know, as I said, is that it is a combination of factors. There are many people who sort of refer to it as our Arab Spring moment. I'm not sure that with the food riot, there were elements of all of these things, and in typical South African fashion, it was sort of a little bit atypical and a bit confused. And so, but it was a grand mix of all of these things put together. And so the point about it is, though, that once you've named it, once the president has said that it's an insurrection, well, then the question is, what do we do about it? And so then there is the point about holding those in power to account for what they say. So when the president says we know who they are, we need to keep saying, well, if you know who they are, can you please arrest them? So where is the evidence? So I think that I don't think we're at a point where we've understood enough about July and about what happens. But the person has said that representative democracies are suffering different crises of accountability that affect the legitimacy of systems. Absolutely. And I think that that's the point that I was trying to make about inequality. So if you have high levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, as we do in South Africa, you can see from the Afrobarometer data that there is the lack of trust in institutions, because people simply go, well, we don't trust the institutions, and so therefore, can we think of an alternative? And that provides an opening, because into a vacuum, anything falls. And we saw that in the Zuma years. And so that is so the democracy has to be given content and substance. And that was the point also I was trying to make about the Constitution, that rights have to be given content, because without that, the document becomes a piece of paper, and then you have an opportunity for people to erode the Constitution. And so, for example, when members of the ANC get up and they talk about the ANC, the Constitution as a white man's document, all of that, and there's misinformation, disinformation. That is to political opportunism, that is to forward a particular agenda. But it talks to somebody who's living in a shack and who has no prospect of ever getting a job, because why should they protect and defend the Constitution? Hence the point about, and that puts, as you say, Anara, the Constitution under threat, representative democracy under threat. And the Constitution itself envisages this participation, this golden thread. But we have to make it work. We have to work at it more assiduously. And so it is a crisis for democracy around the world. And so, as I again said, we should be vigilant. And so we shouldn't take for granted that, well, that doesn't happen here. What July showed us is that it very much happened here. And we need to, if we want to pick ourselves up, we're going to, on an economic front, but also these sorts of meetings, these conversations, but also building mass movements from below. That's all. I mean, July was a terrible, terrible period. And so, as I said, we can't continue as before. We have to keep building, because the alternative is unbounded by rules.
Thank you, Judith. So, ladies and gentlemen, the time now is 10:45. We have come to the end of this session. I would like to thank our keynote speaker for an insightful presentation. The discussion was equally exciting. So thank you. See you next time.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Judith.